Welcome, everyone. It's Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. Today, military and geopolitics with retired U.S. Brigadier General Robert Guidry, who also happens to be a great entrepreneur. So before we quite get to that, and one, this will be a long-form discussion. This will be intense. And for those of you that may be a little more sensitive about issues that relate to military, to geopolitics, to the government, and to me, it all circles back in my world of family offices, then this could be a conversation that will make some of you feel a little uncomfortable. Again, I've said this before. I believe the family office community is way too play it safe, play it down the middle, don't cover any topics that are slightly controversial. But when you look at the studies by big banks and the research that I do with my database of thousands of family offices this year, partially due to a political election year here in the US, areas pertaining to geopolitics are effectively the number one concern of the ultra wealthy. So you're damn right. I'm going to cover it. I'm going to try to be fair and balanced from all perspectives. But I got a lot of questions for our special guest today. So I hope you enjoy it. All of you follow me on my social media platforms, Family Office TV, effectively on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Twitter, and many of you know me as well, of course, for being the founder and CEO at SFO Continuity, private membership club, and Family Office Masterclass. So a little bit about our special guest today. Robert E. Guidry is a tech entrepreneur and investor. He was born in, you're going to test me a little bit here, Rob, Opelousas, Louisiana. In case you're wondering, and by his last name, of course, that's Cajun. He enlisted in the Army in 1983 and was a direct commission into the Army Reserve in 1986. He is formerly a U.S. Army Brigadier General and was the commanding general of the 86th Training Division. He, as I noted, has been a very successful entrepreneur as well. His military experience inspired him to create technology that could be used to find, correlate, and visualize intelligence data to make better decisions. Rob, and I insist to you, for those of you, Angela, where's your proper etiquette and manners? Trust me. One, Rob, thank you for your service, but he does want to be called Rob, so I listen to what people tell me. Rob, how are you?
I'm doing well, and hey, it's a pleasure to be here, Angelo. Looking forward to engaging and talking about a few things.
Let's get to it. So I'm going to start with something that I read many a year ago, and I dusted it off. Goes back to 1999, and it is by someone who is probably a bit of a bifurcating figure. That would be the pundit Patrick Buchanan. But I think he had a very interesting comment. I read, at the opening of the 20th century, there were 5 great Western empires, powers, the British, the French, the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian, and 2 emerging great powers in the US and Japan. However, by the end of that century, admittingly 25 years ago, by the end of that century, really only one, the United States, remained. And when asked, why did they all perish? And he didn't really give context to it, but the answer was simply war. I think I know what he means, whether you're starting it, but perhaps not finishing it, the impact on the morale of the people, whether you win or lose, that could also matter, as well as the financial drain at times to a country. Would you agree with Buchanan's comment, and could you add context to it if you do?
Yeah, I actually do, and I was in the early '80s a big follower of what Pat Buchanan had to say. Some of which was a little controversial, but objectively, some of it also made sense. I think that if you were to look at what he's saying and you were to talk about where we were versus where we are, it's a natural tendency of nations who reach a certain level of maturity to begin exporting their wealth, and it manifests itself in war. The problem with that is not just the blood and the treasure, but the loss of focus on your own internal self. And if you were to ask the contemporaries of Mr. Buchanan today where we're going wrong, it is really a loss of focus on keeping our own house in order while taking And if you look at Iraq, you look at Afghanistan, you look at Syria, you look at North Africa, you look at all of the places that the United States has extended itself, including into Ukraine and Israel and other places. It's not that individually you could argue that any of these things aren't things that we should be doing, but at what cost to our own house internal. And the amount of money that was left on the tarmac and in other facilities and military weaponry in Afghanistan, that amount is more than bringing chip manufacturing back into the United States, or a lot of these other things that we could be doing. So I really think it's not just the war, it's the shifting of the focus that goes along with these wars. And, Orwell had a few things to say about that as well. It's kind of what you do. War external is what you do, but at the cost of again, a focus on your own house.
Indeed. There's going to be some follow-up and later questions I have that are going to bring and loop some of the issues in with that. So audience, stay tuned. As I noted, this will be a long-form interview and hopefully a lot of areas that you're going to find very intriguing. I believe it was a couple of months ago, I took some show notes when I was watching it, but didn't really do a lot of the research behind it. 60 Minutes had an episode actually in October. It basically showcased 5 intelligence officers from the US and other Western countries, and they asked them what is, quote unquote, the biggest intelligence threat to the world. Now, the first thing I thought was, one, I'm intrigued. I do want to hear what they have to say. And I'm not someone who always looks for the dark side of something, but they're all coming on an iconic show like 60 Minutes. They're all being public with something. If it was that secret, they wouldn't be going on 60 Minutes. So they probably have a message they want to get out, or it simply is a misdirect. I'm going to let you answer that once I broadly give you what they said. They basically said it's China. China from the perspective of IP, from the perspective of stealing, quote unquote, from the left, or from the left, or maybe both sides, from the West, left and right. And I'm not disagreeing that those things are challenges. I'm just wondering, why would they make it public if it really is number one? And am I probably correct? They're looking to get a message or a misdirect out there.
If you were to ask me the very same question, I would probably give you the same answer that they did. Now, maybe not for the same reasons, because I can't speak to their reasons, but within the answer itself, they're right. And why that is relevant is that, and I'll give you a perfect example. I'll keep this one very short. We went to Iraq and we went to fix what our allies saw as a problem. We went into Iraq, we put investment into it, and we never asked to keep anything. We didn't commandeer land, we didn't seize their oil, we didn't do that. China has a completely different approach. When China gets involved in something, it's what can I keep? What can I make as a part of my machine that makes me stronger, that makes me more powerful? And when they send students to the United States, or they send workers here on work visas, or they invest in tech companies, they're not investing in the tech company for the return necessarily, although I'm sure they like the return. It's what does this get me, China, for my own next generation? So it's not the same as UK stealing intellectual property, or another company or another country stealing intellectual property. They actually have people here who look at the products that we envision, they see what's selling, they will get them back in China, and they're mass produced and counterfeit. The world market, all you have to do is go to Wish or DHgate or any of these other sites, and you can find a product that's near identical to almost every American product and technology at 1/10 the price. So from an intelligence standpoint, I say that's real. And from an economic harm, I would say that that's real. But I can't speak to their motivations.
An advantage of the US And I think this is pretty obvious. Well, there's multiple. We have what? Fish on both sides
Yes.
in terms of oceans. And let's broadly go with a nice term of friendly-ish neighbors to the north and to the south, and pretty simplistic. When I came back from Europe, a relatively small country like Austria is what, bordered by 7 different countries and landlocked. It's a completely different scenario. But maybe that was a misdirect question by me after all. I think an advantage is our rule of law and our tremendous respect. I'd like to hope it's weakening a little bit, but for property rights. Now we could go back into a history lesson. Who were the first settlers that came here from the West? What was their cultural heritage? What were they getting away from? And why that was going to be important to them, AKA personal freedoms, rule of law, and property rights. That could be a historical discussion that some people may want to go a little back and forth on for a different time. My argument, and I think you might even feel differently, is that's all well and good, but that's only backed up by the threat of effectively force through law enforcement, for lack of a better word, or AKA for other countries looking to disrespect that or take that, our military. Where would you agree and where would you disagree?
I think rule of law is something that is very unique to the United States. And I would say that if you were to go back, say, 200 years ago, pretty much every immigrant that was coming here was coming from a country where by decree, the ruler could take everything, or their property, their rights, their job. And this was one of the very few places in the world, and the preeminent place in the world, where you could get away from 6 generations of serfdom, show up here, create a new product, become wealthy, and your last name didn't matter. And that was very, very unique. But I will tell you that the danger of that is that much of our economy, much of our success has been based on the world's view that the United States is truly adhering to rule of law, and that a person who works in the Philippines an entire life and amasses $2 million worth of wealth can invest that here in the United States, and it's safe, not on a return, but their property is safe. If they buy an apartment, it's theirs, or they buy a house, it's theirs. If you own something, it's yours. And we run a risk that when people begin to question our adherence to rule of law and property rights, such as the squatter problems on investment properties. If I buy a property and somebody breaks into my home and it declares themselves its resident, in some states, it can be a year or more for you to get it back. And you have no recourse when they've destroyed the property. The people will stop investing in things that are not protected by rule of law. And why is that important for us as a superpower? We can go back to the petrocurrency. We can go back to the US dollar as a staple, not just for petroleum, but for security. People will invest in dollars, not for the treasury return, but for the stability of it, and have been doing so for 100 years, which has really, really helped us. But if we begin to inject politics and justice, and people begin to question our adherence to rule of law, I think that the economic model for the damage that could do to the U.S. economy, industry, values, inflation, our currency are completely unknown. I have not seen an economic model that looks at the damage done when world perception about U.S. rule of law becomes damaged to the point where it impacts their decision to partake in the U.S. or to play in the U.S. economy.
Incredibly well said. I'm going to dive into some questions that are going to be somewhat around those issues upcoming. One brief comment before that, a little random, but it popped in my head as you were talking. There's a very well-known show that people know called Yellowstone, an area of the country where I happen to love, Greater Montana and Wyoming, but that same writer creator created a show, I believe it's called 1883. So it takes place well before then. The moral is the Wild West was literally the Wild West. And what the US did was put advertisements in like Romanian papers in countries where people maybe lack the level of freedom, in other countries in Europe, and basically telling them, come here, we have a plot of free land for you in the land of the free. So they would come here for nothing, be given effectively the basics of a wagon and maybe a fellow group and a couple of days of food and water, and, go get them. Here's a map. It's yours, but you got to travel a couple of 100 miles to get there. And it's going to be very, very treacherous. But that spirit of freedom, of personal property rights was so strong for people. They were willing to very much risk a hard life, to risk their life for the perspective of it's theirs. And that goes to the whole spirit of being a libertarian, effectively at heart, which I don't want to get on a big soapbox and make that the big discussion of today. But nonetheless, now that I have made that comment, let's get a little bit into, which relates to all of this. Any large organization, aka government, aka the military part of the US government, is inherently bureaucratic. It becomes risk adverse and to some degree clueless. We spend what? 750 million on quote unquote defense. Is a fair amount of that not utilized properly and bureaucratic? I'm 100% sure of that, but I'm going to ask you that. But my bigger point is we always spend too much until the one day when we really, really, really need it. If you don't have the threat of your defense is so strong, others are not going to desire to attack you. But if by some chance they do, they're beaten down harshly and quickly, then what do property rights and all of that really matter at all?
Well, there's a lot to digest there, because if we were to talk about the military and its use of its budget and the objective outcomes of the use of the budget, boy, there's a lot to handle there. I agree with you 100%. I think that I am not now, nor am I ever suggesting that the defense budget be cut. What I am, on the other hand, is, perhaps a rarity in that I absolutely expect outcomes for that. I expect equipment, ammunition, people, planes that work, things that are efficient. I'm not opposed to experiments here and there, but the experiments have to amount to something and they have to bring those products into production. And I think that the way that today we buy efforts, not outcomes, is completely upside down. The lion's share of military contracting is to good companies, but we task them with the wrong thing. We pay them billions of dollars for efforts without outcomes, without objectives being required. Let's say, for instance, that the government needs a new intelligence system. We will award that to a company and we will tell them, they will say, well, how many people of what caliber and skills are they going to provide? Because they're not providing any software. They're providing people to give efforts. And so the thing we're paying for is hours, not software, not outcomes. And nowhere in the commercial world does that exist. There's no way that any commercial client of ours or any other software company would buy ours. They say, I need a CRM system. I need it to work. It needs to be up and running by 6 months. Here's the milestones. And you're going to get the majority of your money when you're successful. We don't do that. We don't do that with technology. We don't do that with aircraft. We don't do that with, we do it with military vehicles, which is really interesting because some of the most awesome military trucks cost less than a commercial truck. I mean, they're so competitive on price. You see this big 5-ton, 6-wheel vehicle that is hardened and amazing, and it's $100,000. And you're like, how did they get that level of efficiency? Well, the reason they did is because they're buying the truck. They're not buying the effort. But then you go into other areas, anything that's technical, we are buying effort. So it ends up costing 5 times, 10 times, sometimes 15 times as much as it would to a commercial entity buying the same relative product. And unfortunately, that is not beans, that's not bullets, that's not people, that's not ammunition, it's not the things we need.
No, and that's the problem with anything that becomes large and bureaucratic, effectively is run by the government. Not to say that certain level of government services aren't needed. Of course they are. And defense, in theory, would for sure be one of them. But again, going back to look at what happened the turn of the prior century, and all those superpowers were effectively wiped out for a variety of reasons, but we brought up one of them. Generally, the country that controls the world's reserve currency, well, it doesn't take a genius to say one of the reasons why they probably have the world's strongest military. Now, things are changing, different dynamics. It's becoming more of a cyber world, and we're going to get into 5G warfare and all that. But I'm assuming the US government, the powers that be, and the utilization of our 3-letter agencies and military is sometimes used covertly behind the scenes to make sure that the US dollar remains, quote unquote, some people pronounce it differently, but US dollar hegemony. The US dollar is king. It's dominant. I don't want you to give away any internal secrets from back in the day, but I'm sure you're familiar with the importance to the US that some would believe that maintaining the dollar as the world's reserve currency, and you hinted at one reason why, is very important.
Now, I'm gonna take a contrarian position to this a little bit. I wish that what you were saying was true. I wish that the people in our intelligence agencies, in our State Department, wanted and promoted exactly what you're saying. I fear, and I will tell you that, like I spent 40 years in uniform. I served from an E1 clerk typist to, command special operations, joint special operations, aviation test pilot, Pentagon strategist, all over the place. I don't get that from our bureaucracy, that they are at all aligned with the financial interests of the United States. They tend to be suburban, slightly left-leaning, slightly apologetic for America's past success. And we're talking about appointees, we're talking about, we're talking all over the place. I ran into this all over the place, where I would work with my interagency associates, especially in special operations, and the degree to which they were apologetic for America's success was shocking and almost dangerous to me. As I said, it's okay. I mean, we're America. We tolerate a great belief system, but one of the things that we should be doing is, when we put the American military or the American diplomacy or American financial aid out there, it should also be aligned with our intention to keep America as the world's reserve currency, and to also promote American manufacturing and such. But they're not really aligned. I don't see that coming up in meetings, and it just doesn't seem to be something that the current generation of administration, I don't mean the current administration, I mean the current generation of administrations, is promoting the way that, because I think that in many cases, they believe that we're so far ahead, that we're so safe, that it doesn't really matter, that our economy is so strong that it just doesn't matter. I disagree. I look under the rug, and I see that if we, that this could slip. So I wish that they were more pro-American currency, pro-American industry, and they should be. But I haven't seen it, and I've been in places where I should have seen it a lot more than I saw. I saw more from the military. I saw military people asking those questions, but not State Department and Commerce and certainly not in the agencies. And I wish it were more so like that.
Well, then there's a perspective of what is now will always be, which of course is foolish. Going back to my earlier history lesson, 1800s, I'm assuming the British Empire and Navy kind of ruled the seas. And then, of course, they got what? Woke. They got lazy. They thought things would always be as they were, but they're not. There comes an industrial power that's actually producing real things. In that example, it was Germany. In this example now, is it China versus the US? Is my example a good example, or where, and hopefully so, it might fall off the rails?
Well, which example are we? Which example are we talking about? Are we talking about China, or I mean, in what respect? I would like to dig into that a little more.
To the fact, basically, of our lack of a manufacturing base, a little bit of the analogy
Yes,
that I gave with the British and Germany. Do we appear to be falling down the path of 130 to 40 years ago that the British were? Things will always be as they are.
Yes, I agree with that completely. Look, there is a value in turning sand into glass. If you can take sand and you can melt it in a manufacturing plant and shape it and it becomes drinkware, you have turned sand into glass. And that value add that you've done, that is how I like to explain manufacturing. It's turning something that is cheaper into something that has greater value. And that process creates wealth. Now, if you were to go back 40 years ago, it didn't matter that we weren't turning sand into glass because we owned the only places selling the glasses. So we would undervalue the commodity, the manufactured commodity, and try to make the money at retail. But with the advent of Amazon and Alibaba and all of these global marketplaces, retail margins have gone way down. Thus, the wealth creation really is in the manufacturing. It's no longer even in the design, or since we don't make the machines that make the goods, or we don't design the machines that make the goods, we are finding ourselves squeezed into selling each other insurance, selling each other banking and investment instruments. But are we really solidly locked into the foundation of the economic value creation that is manufacturing? No. And the other, I think also there's a bit of, and I want to say fairness. There are a lot of people in the United States who do not, nor ever will, go to college and become an engineer. And they want to do more than clean people's houses, and they want to do more than mowing somebody's lawn. They're very proud to build a car. They're very proud to build a home or a boat or a good or a service. And these people will live their entire lives in America as Americans and will not, be working upstairs designing the next one, but they want to participate in the economy in an important way. And I think that the idea that, that some have, especially some on the left, that we're too good to be manufacturing, we'll leave that for somebody else. I think we're leaving a significant portion of America out of having pride and honor in what they do. And, it's a funny, and totally inappropriate for a family office thing, but I'll do it anyway. South Park has a great episode.
It's a great show.
It's a great show. They really touch on everything. Look, South Park has a great episode on where a handyman and a plumber become the most essential people in the entire town.
That was recent.
They end up driving Bentleys and having handlers. And meanwhile, all the engineers, architects, and bankers are sort of begging for their, or bidding for their services. It's a little unrealistic, but it does speak to the importance of what we would call the non-academic leaning career progressions that are important, of which manufacturing is a big one.
I didn't ever think I'd have in our discussion the great show of South Park come up. I might have to put it in some of my show notes to get some clickbait attention. But I actually, my son, who's in college, introduced me to that episode maybe about 5 or 6 weeks ago. And of course, it was a little over the top. It's meant to be a little extreme, but there was more than truth to it. I mean, you can't even fix the hinge on the door to like a cabinet. And that was the character, Randy, by the way, one of the fathers. And it just goes to show, oh, the handyman's busy for 3 months. Like he has, and now you got to overpay him and bid to try to see if you can get him to move up. And that's how they became super rich and are going to space and buying exotic cars. Interesting. So now some wars are fought, I guess you could say, out of convenience, and some more out of simply extinction. You lose, you're maybe not there. So I get it. It needs context to how I'm going to ask my question. So I'll ask it to be clickbaity without a lot of context. Does this country, the US, have the will to win a war?
Okay. Within this country, the answer is yes. There is, in my experience, and look, I am a very typical warrior class soldier. I grew up on a dirt road in central Louisiana, could never have imagined not going into the military. I went in for a specific thing, which is to learn to better myself, become in my own mind, what I define as a man by my cultural norms, and to become a warrior so that I could see for myself if I could. That is still about 10% of the military. These are people from either the rough areas of the cities or the rural areas of the farms, and they have joined the military to be warriors. There was a point where it was 30, 40%. In recent years, that has gone way down. And if you look at the statistics, all 100% of the shortages of recruits in the Army today is directly attributed to the demographic that I come from. That is exactly shortage for shortage, person for person, because they have very openly discounted the value of the traditional warrior class. And they have discouraged the traditional warrior class. They have demeaned the traditional warrior class. We have sat in briefing after briefing about how it's got a degree of toxicity to it. And I don't mean race or gender or any of that. I just mean the warrior class, the people who we come from all religions. I mean, I'm Native American and Jewish and raised in a Cajun community. So I don't really know what that means for me, what I am. But what I'm saying is the people who aspire to be warriors, the military has done great damage in their desire to promote diversity. They didn't just promote diversity, and promoting diversity is a great thing. But if you must do so by openly criticizing others, and that's the mistake they made. They openly criticized as toxic the warrior class within their own ranks and made people sit in rooms and listen to this over and over again. So it's 10%. So 10% of the military today, the Army, that I love. I mean, I gave 40 years of my life to the Army. In fact, I like to say the Army gave 40 years of life to me. I am thankful for every day I ever spent in it and loved it all the way up to the last day. But people like me who see war as a thing that you want to avoid, but if you're going to engage in it, it needs to be done to win, and you work hard to win, and that's what you focus on, we're about 10%. I would say that 10% is highly effective. And that 10% could probably encourage about another 10% to do extremely well. But if you were to look at the majority of the DoD today, I don't think that the majority of the DoD is ready for war. I think that elements of the DoD are ready for war. And within each organization, there are extraordinary achievers. And I tell you, Angelo, I had the privilege of, and I won't go into it, but I had the privilege of going, from, I was a clerk typist and I became an aviator. Well, aviators, by their very nature, tend to be, from the top 5% of academics and science and physical fitness. And then I went from that into special operations, and then I went into joint special operations. And then I went into joint special operations in the very, very small exclusive areas where it's sort of the best of the best of the best. And I saw performance where, 10 guys from that organization could take on 150 from an opposing force and do so systemically and successfully. I mean, the ratio of performance of America's best versus our adversaries is just incredible. But again, it's a small segment of the Army, and I am thankful to every one of those for what they're doing. And they're in there and they're ready to fight and they're ready to do their duty. And that's against China. That's against, I don't really think we're going to go against Russia anytime soon. I mean, that's a thing people say. Russia can't get past Ukraine. They're not coming here. But yeah, I think that 10% is just extraordinary. And I think they could pull another 10% with them. And that's why we win when we do free those people. We free our soldiers to execute their jobs. When you free them up, they're highly successful. When you put them under a lot of conditions, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, and all this other stuff that they're not equipped for, we're not that good at that.
Excellent answer. And yeah, these are perhaps some would say some touchy subjects, but again, I don't want to play it safe. I don't want to be like everyone else in the family office world that never goes down the world of subjects that we need to openly discuss from both sides. So if it's down from 30 or 40% to 10%, but in today's world with modern technology, and again, one person who's truly a warrior can make an impact, you could argue, quote unquote, 10% might be enough, unless that number of 10% is dwindling, not in terms of the ratio of 10%, but the larger overall number. It's 10% of 1 million. Now it's 10% of 500,000. Now it's 10% of 100,000. It's lesser and lesser. So I think that would probably, as you're describing it, that would probably be what I would define as the Southern or Midwestern, more rural-esque male. So again, times are changing. I do understand that. And those people are often felt left aside, that they're not really wanted. They're not even looking at that as being a viable opportunity for them to serve their country and provide value. And that's terrible. To think that there's, nefarious forces at work to weaken that will, so-called toxic masculinity. It's toxic until you want that Navy SEAL or warrior in general to come in and save your butt. And then it's not so toxic, is it? So again, these are issues. They're very sensitive. We could do deep dives into a variety of different things relative to it. I've had Green Berets and others on that have told me, one, something similar to what you said. And also, why is it from, you could argue, maybe Southern or Midwestern, and some of it may simply relate to their belief in community and their strength and belief of a higher power, aka religion. It's more than just them. In the movie Captain America, I believe it was the first movie, and he's from New York City. So again, it's fictional, but it's not only rule. One of the tests to see who's going to get that secret serum is they put a fake grenade that they don't know is fake and throw it on the ground. And this skinny guy, Steve Rogers, is the only one who dives on it to save his brethren, who didn't even really probably care for him, but he cares about them and a greater mission. And that helped to prove his point that he was worthy of getting the serum to become, quote unquote, Captain America, the super soldier. There's a weakening in that level of faith and religion, which again, I don't want to make it a religious conversation. So that's kind of a part one. And part two, others have told me at the highest level of special forces, there's an unusual number of people that were from the Mormon religion. And they were just very dedicated to being truly, it's bigger than them, the warrior class. Now, trying not to get either of us in trouble, how would you answer my question about a belief in faith and religion? And do Mormons, relative to their percentage of the population, make up an unusually high percentage of either warriors or higher level special operations fighters?
Okay. The corpus of Mormon population in the United States is very small as a percentage of the total American population. And absolutely, statistically speaking, Mormons they definitely outperform the size of their population in becoming military warriors. I would say that their statistical propensity to get into, and we're not talking about combat service support, clerk typist stuff, but to get into combat arms, into Ranger, airborne, getting into special forces, all that, absolutely. That as a group, and I think that I can't say that it's about the Mormon religion per se, but I think I can say it's about the values that come with it. And there's a degree of realism that Mormons value, that life is hard, that we're human, that we're on this earth. You have to work hard, that no one, just because you're here, someone doesn't owe you something. Nobody owes you anything. They have personal responsibility. All of these things, which, by the way, in some of this over-the-top social engineering stuff that the military adopted, is seen as toxic. Personal responsibility, nuclear family, all of those things are classifying you as an oppressor, which I don't think any of that stuff belongs in the military at all. And whoever did it really needs to be held accountable at some point, because the amount of damage done, you don't hear. Like, I was a commanding general, and I would tell you something. We did everything we were required to do. But then afterwards, you listen to the soldiers talking, and they're just like, these are good soldiers saying, I just don't know how much longer I can do this being a soldier. They come out of one of these mandatory briefs, and you haven't built them up. You haven't lifted them up. I don't know who you lifted up by it. Maybe you stoked some anger, but how did we go from Mormons to that? I think it's about culture. I think it's the idea that, when you wake up, Army never owed me anything. The Army gave me an opportunity to become the person that I always wondered if I could be. And I remember when I hit about 30, maybe 35 years old, I looked at myself and I said, okay, I approve of me now. Before that, I never knew if I would approve of me, but I approved of me. Now, that didn't mean I was rich. It didn't mean I was tall, because I'm not, or good looking, or any of that particular stuff. But as a person, within my ethos, within my sense of self, it gave me an opportunity to validate, or to go out and build myself and then validate that. And I think that is appealing to people of certain backgrounds. And I would say more so the people of Mormon background. Yeah.
Well, that was a great answer. Actually, it was so good broadly, this part of our discussion. I wouldn't be shocked. The U.S. Army and the military should probably use clips of this video in some of their recruitment processes. And again, certainly from someone from my perspective, basically from me, a family of immigrants, some immigrants that were in the military. Again, thank you for your service. It's greatly appreciated. A controversial figure, Eric Prince of Blackwater, made a statement that I think is probably 100% true, but you could help me understand it a little better. The Army usually promoted about 3 and 4 of officers from captain to major. But recently, that number has gone up to probably, I think, above 95%. Where's the qualifications? Where's the standards? Not everyone is going to be great. Like, this is the problem with becoming too bureaucratic. It becomes a political football where people are just moving up the rank for the sake of rank. You probably have a lot to say about this.
Oh, I do. I do. Here's the problem. Okay. Look, when I joined under Reagan, I joined the Army from, basically a, Cajun kid in Reagan's first era. Everybody wanted to serve. I mean, the numbers of people, the competition to get in was there. When I became an officer, the competition was amazing. When I became an aviator, the competition was amazing. And when I went from captain to major, I was still an operational pilot at the time. Every captain wanted to be a major. So therefore, out of the class of captains going for major, they were only able to select, usually in your second look, 30%. Well, today, most of the really sharp ones are leaving. They're leaving. They're out at captain. They're done. They've paid for their West Point graduation or their West Point thing. They're out of their ROTC. They're just not interested anymore. They're going to go off and build other careers. So what's left of captains going for major? You've lost. If you were to take on merit, on strength, agility, IQ, academics, performance, if you were to take the top 30% of all captains, 2/3 of those have no interest in ever being a major. They're leaving. Of the very best, of the best, 2/3 of them are gone. So what you're left with, and then a number of the others are gone. So the reason is, it's not that we're promoting more, it's that the number who want to stay in past captain is vastly less. And that is cultural, and that's a cultural problem. It's not a pay problem. You can't bonus your way out of that. But then you can't on one hand want the best of the best and then sit there and say, well, yeah, but we can't promote the best of the best. We need to do this and we need to do that. And I'll tell you, one has only to look at the generals today. The generals today. Look at their backgrounds and ask yourself how many of those meet the qualifications that would have been required in a more competitive environment. And I'm not attacking anybody. Look, not everybody. I was never going to be an astronaut. I was not a good enough performer. I wanted to be an astronaut. That's why I went to go become a test pilot. And that's why I wanted to do that. I wasn't good enough. And you know what? And that's okay. It's not because I'm a Cajun. It's not because my mother was born on an Indian reservation. It's not, I wasn't good enough. And frankly, if they were to make me either an astronaut or an airline pilot based on the fact that my mother was born on a Choctaw reservation, I don't think that's a good idea. But we're doing that stuff. And the problem is that the best, we're losing so many of the best that what's left, they're patriots. These are good people. They're very good people. I'm not criticizing their loyalty to this nation or their competency. For God's sakes, they're military Army officers. But what I'm saying is, going back 20 years ago, a lot of people who are generals today would have retired at lieutenant colonel. Perhaps me too. Maybe I wasn't good enough. And the fact that less stayed in elevated my own chances. I'll leave that for others to judge. But the competition, the quality of the competition has gone down.
Obviously. Moving on to a different subject, a popular movie on Netflix based on a popular book that's a little dated. I think it goes back 15 plus years ago, but the movie's new on Netflix. It's called Leave the World Behind. And it talks about 3 steps that almost sound a little bit out of the Green Beret handbook for overthrowing countries in the 80s and 90s. I believe it's step 1 is isolation, implied as shutting down a nation's communication or transportation. In today's world, maybe not literally shutting down communication, but maybe controlling it. Step 2 is synchronized chaos. And effectively, step 3, we could call different things, but broadly, quote unquote, civil war.
Mhm.
I'm not stating that those things cannot happen, that they're maybe still not effective for quote unquote forces to use. I'm sure they are. But, and again, maybe I tend to look too deeply into either misinformation. It's ironic the movie came out a while after the book was written, but it does feel like something from 20 or 30 years ago. And if you read General Flynn's book, 5G Warfare, he basically talks about that as well, that it's changed. It's not those things that I mentioned that were in Leave the World Behind, or at least not fully. There's other things that we're going to talk about on manipulating financial markets, on computational power, on a variety of things. I don't know how familiar you are with the book or movie, but broadly about that concept, the old Green Beret handbook of overthrowing a country. By the time we find out about it as the public, either it's meant to be misinformation or it's wickedly outdated.
You know, whether it be this particular movie, or whether it be Orwell, or whether it be Piven, this school of thought has existed for a long time. I think it manifests itself a little bit differently today, but you know, you can't go into a country and cut their rail lines and actually impact their ability to Google something. But having said that, you can do the opposite. So if, you know, one of my favorite shirts, and, you know, one of the nice things about being a tech entrepreneur and working with a building full of nerds is we all wear funny t-shirts all the time. You know, I have a couple of them. One of them is, you know, make Orwell fiction again. I've got another one that says, think well, it's still legal. You know, we do that, but a lot of times it's Star Wars stuff. But I'll tell you that we have the ability, and we do it now, to isolate people, whether it's isolating from medical, whether relating to, you know, I'll use a couple of controversial topics. COVID. When COVID first came out, you know, one of the things, I own a tech company. One of the things my company does is we do social media analytics, and we were doing that before COVID. And there were things that were available about the academic research being done on the precursor to this virus that were widely available on the internet before COVID came out, which then were no longer findable. So you ask, isolate people from facts, whether it be a candidate who gets blocked by social media, or whether it be an idea, or whether it be, but you know, right now, and again, you know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist of any kind at all, and I will stay completely away from that. But the internet, in a large way, determines what information enters your life, and that's undeniable. So that is something that is, as far as isolation, probably the most powerful way to isolate people is through information. The second step that you mentioned, which is to, you know, create a little chaos. I mean, one is only to turn on the news, and we see these groups out creating movements based on a partial truth. It could be a truth. In some cases, there are truths. I mean, there are tragic events that happen all over this country, whether it was, you know, January 6th or the you know, police brutality, or the death of a citizen, or whatever. And we create, and somehow that turns into burning things, and, you know, burning things and occupying and destroying and, you know, looting businesses and all of that. That is kind of why, and I mentioned Orwell when you first said this, because, you know, what Orwell, it was not only isolating what you have, but then creating a sense of turbulence. And if you'll notice in Orwell's history, and also in Animal Farm in 1984 and others, they inject this idea of promoting an idea and then changing the idea and telling you the other idea never existed. And then when you adopt that one, then changing that idea again and telling you that other idea never existed. And we can start with East Anglia Institute for Climate Research and the origins of the global warming crisis, which then when the models didn't work out, it became climate change, and then it became the Chicago Climate Exchange or the Carbon Exchange. And I know a lot more about that than most Army veterans would, but it's a movement that is trying to go somewhere. And sometimes, you need to hype something a little bit, which means you get ahead of the facts. And I'm not claiming there's any nefarious intent there, but look, I want a clean environment. But we get into the movement, there are a lot of things that are said that aren't true, but are necessary to get people to do the things that you want them to do, which actually would impact the environment. I subscribe to the theory that citizens can handle the truth. Okay. I think we can clean up the earth without necessarily promoting some things that aren't necessarily true. But back onto your to the movie analogy, the third step is civil war. But I don't know that it's really, when you say it's a civil war, what it is the powers that quietly created the first effect and then quietly created the second effect are now making themselves known because they already have the power by having initiated the first two effects. So that's the last battle against who you're looking to defeat in the takeover of another country is, block the information, create some chaos, create some uncertainty. And the Civil War is just sort of the manifestation of the final stage of that process. But, in a lot of cases, it's not even really much of a civil war. You've already grabbed the narrative space of the mindsets of the citizens. So, which actually brings me up to, if you ever want to talk about Taiwan, that's actually a really interesting use case of the narrative space that the Chinese can't get the third one done. They can't get inside of the heads of the Taiwanese, and they haven't been able to get there. But that's a topic for another time.
Well, since you did bring it up, obviously China could military crush them in about a minute, but they don't. Therefore, that latter one has been a hard one. And maybe compare that. And boy, we're going down some dangerous areas, so we'll be careful. Are we in kind of a cold civil war? I did not say hot, cold civil war in the US now. An election year, political bifurcation, the recent ruling by the Supreme Court on the border and how the state of Texas may simply not listen. We'll find out. So I'm comparing what's going on in China and Taiwan to what's going on here, but why don't I allow you the creative freedom to dive into both?
Wow, diving into both. The border crisis, if you want to call it a crisis, I see it as a crisis. I'm a libertarian leaning person. So I see mass numbers of people and we don't necessarily know who they are. It's problematic. Okay. It's problematic. Absolutely. And we could fix that with a presidential decree, and a presidential decree that undoes the presidential decrees that undid what was working. That's an easy problem to fix. The biggest problem is the people behind it. Some have what I would consider to be, character flaws that are causing them to support this. But most of them are thinking more in lines of the economy of the United States needs an infusion of people to offset the lack of population growth of the current citizenry. So if you look at the people who've made it in the United States, they own a home, they have a retirement plan, they have health care, they have education, they have cars, they pay their taxes. They're not reproducing. By and large, they're not replacing themselves. And that's a fact, though that is not. And so the idea is you bring in another generation that comes in with, language barriers and no skills, and then their kids are born in the United States, go to our schools, and to get to college, and then their kids get to that level that we talked about that isn't reproducing. So the theory that, when you quietly get people away, I mean, there are people who said, no, look, we need at least 30,000 workers because they're not being born, or frankly, they have, medicinal cards. The kids today, they have their medical marijuana cards, and they're just not interested in driving a UPS truck or picking, or working in a plant or learning to weld. And that's true. We have a cultural problem with the kids we do have, in that a significant number of them just don't want to do, they just don't want to do hard work. So
they want to be social media stars, of course.
Yeah, they all want to be influencers and, give people tips on what shoes to wear. But the problem is we all can't do that. I mean, there's just no economic model that works where we do that. And no one will tell them the truth. They get through a school system. Now, I had it a little different. I, went to Louisiana. We had, these Catholic schools with very aggressive nuns who kept you in order and made sure you knew your place in this world. And, today it's everybody special and everybody gets a trophy and everybody gets a whatever. And so the idea is that the person, I raised two boys, and I told them, I said, if you were to look at the average, female Chinese college student in America, what do? They don't have a car. They live on campus. They take 21 hours, and they don't belong to a fraternity, a sorority. If there is a club, I'm sure it's something really nerdy. And they focus on getting the most they can out of the education in that 4 years. For Americans, college is it's a social experience. It's a growing experience. It includes the parties and this and that and all of these other things, which is why our graduation rate started suffering. But then in order to keep the tuition, we've lowered the standards, So, yeah, a lot on immigration. I would say that I see it as problematic. There are people who don't. With regard to China, totally different animal. At one point, a lot of Taiwanese would say that I'm a Taiwanese Chinese, or I'm a Chinese Taiwanese. I'm proud to be a part of China. Now, they knew that they weren't necessarily, that they were a break-off region and that they had their own government, but they kind of related to China. And so as China grew in sophistication and power from being what it was 50 years ago to when it started rising, the amount of Chinese support within Taiwan and that narrative space alignment was actually pretty strong 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But then after what they did to Hong Kong, after what they're doing to their own people, the censorship, China lost that allegiance, that alliance, or that mindset amongst the Taiwanese. I think most recent statistics I saw is that 70% of Taiwanese do not identify themselves as Chinese. That's a huge shift in 20 years. So even if China were to go to Taiwan, they're going to have an insurgency that kind of looks like Iraq did for us in Al-Anbar. And people just don't want to give in. They're not going to, so they'll be fighting that for a long, long time. So I'm a realist. Yes, they could use military force to get boots on the ground in Taiwan. Could we stop them? Could we stop them? Not if they were 100% committed, because I think China would be willing to lose, a few 100,000 people to get it. I really do. They don't see human life the same way we do. They're not bad people, but a lot of countries don't value the individual human life the way that we do. People, but yeah, could they get there? Yeah, they could get there with major losses. And then when they get there, what? They're with a population that doesn't want to be a part of them. And now they end up with an insurgency. So I think that if I were China and if I were advising them, and I think that this is probably what they are being advised now is, we might have to rethink that. We might have to figure out a way to get back in the narrative space mindset of the Taiwanese so that they oppose us less, so that when we do defeat their military, we're not fighting their people. And I think that's my take on China.
Cities, I would assume, it's pretty obvious, are most vulnerable because they don't really produce anything internally that people need to survive, mainly food, water. And you think, and I'm trying to correlate this in, one, I guess I'm asking if you were advising a ultra affluent family that likely is closer or in a city than not, should they have a compound, resources, an hour and a half, 2 hour drive, if need be, from a big city environment?
Yeah, I think that, look, we're in the electronic age, we're in the digital age where people, even in key positions, can telecommute. The need for cities, the need for them is greatly reduced. You still need ports, but where have the ports gone to? They've gone further and further away from the downtown metropolitan areas. If you look at the future of everything, you find an aspect of our lives that we rely on, that where cities are essential. If you go back 100 years, it was very significant. You go today, no. I have my own feeling is you could take the entire United States government and disperse all of the federal agencies across all of the 50 states, which would, really hurt the Virginia, Maryland, and DC economies, and you wouldn't skip a beat. So the future of cities, I think one only really, and this is not a political statement, this is purely economic. I have good friends who own real estate in Beverly Hills, in San Diego, San Francisco, New York, and I talk to them and I look at the future of that. There will always be winners in the city, but the cities won't always be winners anymore. And that is where I think that there's going to be a lot of money lost in urban real estate, especially urban concentration real estate. We're talking about the high-rise offices, the high-rise apartments, and it's hard to acknowledge that while you're making so much money on it right now. But again, where is the new stuff happening? Where's the new innovation centers? I had a meeting with we're in Clearwater, Florida. One of the nice things about being in Clearwater is we're the only true high-tech intellectual property creator in where we are, which means I've got 7 colleges and universities within commuting distance of people who don't want to move. They graduate, so we get our pick. But I was sitting down with this city and I was trying to explain the difference between income or salaries and wealth creation. And I said, when a small startup is in Clearwater and its employees become shareholders, yes, their salaries matter. They go into restaurants, they go into shops, they help your economy, your sales tax, and all of that. But the real value of the startup is the wealth, because at some point they're going to monetize those shares. And when they monetize those shares, they can now create their own. So now they can create their own startups, and that is that no longer has to take place in the urban environments. It can now happen in Nashville, which is now urban, but maybe not a great example. But you can, when you start going to some of these other places like Little Rock and Clearwater, Tampa, Florida, you could create the same thing here. Heck, we did. We're the only knowledge graph neural network developer in the free world. It's a bit nerdy, but what we do, but we're it. And I would tell you, if I'd have tried to do this in Silicon Valley or Boston or New York, the labor costs would have eaten us up, because it was 7 years of R&D that we had to bootstrap. I mean, 7 years of that to build what we built. We couldn't afford it in another world, but in Clearwater we can. Future of cities, I think, it's part of our economy. They'll always be there. They'll be consumers, but they're just not as essential as they once were. And I think that should play into their investment decisions as they look to the future of where they locate what they buy and what they do.
Correct. And again, I promise a lot of what I do, even if it doesn't feel like it in geopolitics, it is very important to, let's call them the rich, the entrepreneurs growing, to family offices. And, Rob's answer to my latest question circles back a little bit into issues relative to city real estate and to the work that I do on sovereign risk and disaster preparedness in my masterclass program and series. These are very, very important topics. So yes, for sure, this topic today does absolutely correlate back to family offices. Relating a little bit to that leave the world behind and the 1, 2, and 3, and steps 1 and 2 may include nefarious forces limiting or hacking our quote unquote electricity, our quote unquote grid, or perhaps even more nefarious, impacting our satellites. Now, I don't think it's as simple as just one wonderful hacker. Hopefully, we have no single point of failure. It's a little bit deeper and more complicated than that. I'm also assuming that we could probably get satellites up by balloons and other things up pretty quick. But basically, this relates to infrastructure. Are we that antiquated in much of it in the US? And is it a threat from either terrorist or nefarious forces broadly?
Yeah, the infrastructure in the US, across the US, of the things that we rely on, everything from, plain old telephone service or POTS to our cable TV, to our communications, to our 4G, 5G, to everything that we rely upon has a degree of it's an ever-changing degree of vulnerabilities. We patch it to known vulnerabilities. People discover new ones. And then we find out about those. We patch them. That's actually a very important area, is intelligence into finding what vulnerabilities are being sold, or, what vulnerabilities are being sold on dark web. I really think, and this is my own opinion, that at various points in the week, month, or year, 100% of our infrastructure is vulnerable at various times throughout the year to various technologies and hacking. I'm not a big fan of that word hacking, but known vulnerabilities, discovered vulnerabilities, created vulnerabilities, so that it is entirely feasible that an adversarial nation state such as China could roving blackout various functions of the United States, from banking and taking down ATM systems to red lights, to all of that is vulnerable. And, Angela, you brought up something earlier, and we were talking about, and I can't remember what the context was, about why it takes a $10 million missile to take down a $2,000 drone. And it all ties in. There is insufficient acknowledgement in physical things, insufficient prioritization into physical things in this country. One of the prime examples of this, and for those of you who are military buffs, the Air Force has a plane called the A-10. And the A-10 has been called the Warthog. It's been called the Hog. It's got all these names. But basically imagine a big Gatling gun. and they built a plane around it. They literally built a plane around a massive autocannon, Gatling gun. And that plane they're all old, they're super low tech, they are, inexpensive to fly, and the Air Force has been trying to get rid of them for 15 to 20 years. And the reason they're trying to get rid of them is because it's not high tech. But A-10 is absolutely perfect for Yemen and Syria and North Africa and anything we were to do in Central America, and 2/3 of what we had to do in Iraq and Afghanistan and everything else, because it's not designed to go after first-in-class technological adversary. It's not. It's designed to be in places that we have air supremacy, air superiority. But I'll tell you something, it'll be the only damn thing flying when stuff gets hacked. So, there's something to be said about the importance of preserving that classic car that you have in your garage when somebody, I can't remember what the name of the movie was that had that scene of all of the Teslas littering the highway. When it was a movie, it was fake.
Yeah, that was the movie that I just referenced.
Yeah, that was the one. Okay. Yeah. The thing is, there is something to be said for gold, silver, platinum, a 1960s car that you keep that is fully non-electronic and doesn't talk to other, or at least a car that doesn't talk to other systems. There's a lot to be said, but that actually manifests itself into a lot of other areas. Like I have a home, I'm in the AI business. I have a home and I have all these electronics that are designed to talk. My dishwasher wants to talk to Sony. My refrigerator wants to talk to Bosch. And I actually manually disable all of that on 100%. And I even fill in the microphone with liquid rubber on my remote controls and all of the other stuff. Now I go a little bit far, but not because I'm a conspiracy, but because why allow a vulnerability? I think that as you make your decisions, I think that investing in tomorrow is important, but I think that we're entering an age of vulnerability, or we are in an age of vulnerability, where what would happen if your cell phone no longer worked and your computers no longer work? Do you even have a Rolodex anymore? Do you know the phone number to your best friend, or do you know your wife's phone number? That's an important one, or your spouse's or significant other's phone number, or is it just programmed in? It's those are things worth thinking about.
For sure. And relates a little bit to a follow-up that I noted on that movie with the work of General Flynn in his book, 5G Warfare, that perhaps it's less so a war of geographies and more so the hearts and minds. That's the fight to be had. But it went a little deeper than that as well. It spoke a little bit about things relative to computational capital. It spoke about manipulation of equity markets, aka mainly the stock market. And simply, even if it's not meant to manipulate and bring down, although that could be a part of it, simply how rogue states, nefarious forces simply have the capability of manipulating for their financial gain. And their financial gain is unfair to others, impacts the wealth of others, and gives them more wealth, aka resources, to do even more nefarious things.
Yeah, that's been so I worked with Mike Flynn up at Fort Bragg JSOC years ago, and smart man, politics out of it because people have all kinds of thoughts on that, but he's a brilliant guy. He brings up something that you've heard me say the term, and I've thrown it out a number of times, called narrative space. And narrative space is where we live within our own heads. How do I see the world? And if you want to convince me of something and you just state facts, you may think that the facts are coming to me, but what I'm doing is I'm taking those facts and balancing them against how I see the world. And so, so everything that we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, we were going after military defeat, but we were never really getting at the how does the population feel? And so to that point, I'll tell you a story. Some years ago, and this is now unclassified, there was a leader who of one of the terrorist groups, and he was driving around in his entourage, and we hit him with a drone, and it was a drone strike as he pulled off into a compound, which was his compound. It was his pattern of life. So it was a remote drone strike takes out leader. Everybody's happy. They're like, yeah, we got this guy. Let's go home for the weekend. By Monday, there were protests in 30 different Arab cities. Why? Because what they did was they took that incident, our adversaries, and spun it as the United States strikes a wedding party. It wasn't a wedding party. It was a meeting of them. You can look at the videos. But what they did was they intermingled that with some footage of some other catastrophes, created a narrative over the weekend, which then resulted in us back on our heels, having to answer even to our own partners and allies in the Middle East as to why we killed everyone at a wedding party. See, so you asked, I mentioned that because it's no different in finance. This was military, but if you're looking at stocks, or you're looking at a particular investment or particular technology or a particular instrument or some sort of cyber currency or a cyber currency exchange, you're relying kind of on what you read and what you research. And yeah, people get ahead of these things, and you'll have a hard time getting to the real facts if they're buried beneath what's gained traction in the social sphere. And some of these folks are really good at it. So I was going to say that at one point I'll tell you the story about the early studies on marijuana. When they were trying to get marijuana legalized, there was all of these studies saying how good it was for you, and they were at the top of all the first 3 pages of any Google search on side effects of THC, side effects of marijuana. Just very hard to get to the real stuff. And that is the narrative that was adopted. I have feelings people should do what they want to do. I'm a libertarian, but it's but just as an example of how to impact what people know and think and do, not hard to do, and it wasn't an expensive campaign.
No, and that relates to so many different things in terms of that you bring up. Think for yourself would be important, but I admit it's harder to think for yourself if before you think you need to research, you need to form a thesis to make an opinion. If the research or those around you are influenced to one side, that probably is going to potentially impact you. So it's easy for me to say think for yourself. It still is accurate. You should dig deeper than just superficial, but much on both sides and around the world. It's getting harder. Everything is manipulated. And yes, this absolutely relates to billionaires and family offices. Effectively, they want to stay rich, purchasing power generationally. They want family continuity. It's getting harder and harder all the time. We don't have the time to go into a deeper dive into, very briefly mentioned earlier, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution. Don't forget, there's way more have-nots than there are haves. When people need to start to spend because of runaway inflation that could be manipulated, 40% or more of their income towards food, and other challenges that I mentioned, and misinformation and quote unquote fake news that could lead to uprisings, riots, civil war, lots of things that could go wrong. And I don't know, just a little bit of research, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, what happened to a lot of the people in power, or AKA the rich? I mean, a nice word, they were kind of taken out. Like, yes. You get the picture. Like this is just, I mean, I hate to say how the world works, and it's gotten, if anything, more treacherous as technology and other advancements have progressed. A little bit out of left field, targeted energy weapons. I don't know if I'm a well-known billionaire, and I'm not going to mention any names, or even if I'm running their family office, which is a very important role. Should I be concerned that I'm out there in the public? There are nefarious, bad actors in sovereign states with apparently, and this was on 60 Minutes too about a year ago, quote unquote, energy weapons that are going to limit that person's capability to perform and or their capability to counter should something bad start to happen to them. You probably didn't expect this question, Rob. It's a little
No, actually, I did not. And when you said targeted energy weapons, I thought we were talking about the future of replacing kinetic rounds on ships and and missiles and with targeted energy weapons. That is actually a whole amazing field. You brought up a very interesting, and yes, there are technologies that you can buy and you can harm people and you can permanently injure them. And you can, if somebody wants to harm you and using ultrasonic and other means, yeah, absolutely, they can do it. This stuff is available. And, if you're a high net worth individual and you have a security person, if you get someone who is formerly of one of the tier 1 units out of Fort Bragg and now Fort something Liberty or Friendly, or I don't know what the heck I'll call it, Fort Bragg for the rest of my life, because that's where it was for my 40 years. They're going to understand this stuff. There are ways to detect. There are means to detect. It is, the ideas of security being only physical, those days are gone. There are so many, it's great to have a very intimidating security person. It's even better if they have a PhD in physics, or it's,
it's less likely to get sued if you put a finger on someone.
Yeah. So, believe it or not, that area is very real. And, if someone were doing that to me right now, I really have no way of knowing. And wouldn't have it. And I'm not saying they are, because they're not. I'm not cognitively being impacted at this point. But yeah, people can hurt you. And I can tell you that, for money, people will do amazing things.
It's a scary world. And again, in my world, mitigating risk is very important. So these are things that I focus on. Related to how you answered that question, and I'm going down, sadly, a very dark hole. We'll come out of it hopefully in 90 seconds and move on. So that person of great wealth that has maybe former 3-letter agency or other people as part of their security detail, let's almost broadly call that mercenary. If things were to really go bad, the dollar is in wicked hyperinflation. It means so little. And you have that compound, you have that protection, but law and order kind of goes out the window. I mean, how safe are you really? Could they be brought out by people paying them gold or other resources? Or very simply, they could simply overtake you. Now, I know I'm going down a terrible road, but no one else is bringing this up. So, at the end of the day, building the underground bunker where you have security detail with you, well, how about their families? How about the fact of they're humans that probably have a very dark side as well? And when there's no consequence and you have what they don't have, what do you think how is that really going to end up?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I don't know about the whole bunker thing. And the reason is that if you were to play out civil unrest, civil war, global thermonuclear war, if you were to play out all of these, people don't send an intercontinental ballistic missile to a cornfield. They don't. They go after cities and military and missile bunkers. So you get away from, like where I live right now. I am very strategically just outside of the blast radius of anything of interest in Tampa. That's where I bought my home. There is nothing interesting that they're going to want to hit in Clearwater. And if you look at prevailing winds, I'm upwind of where prevailing winds are. So if there were a nuke to hit, that's not why I bought my home there, but I do think about things like that. I think that, do you remember, and of course everybody remembers this scenario when you had all of the George Floyd riots, and so people went into a gated community and they're, basically threatening violence, and this one couple comes out on their lawn. And it was a bad look. I will tell you, it was a bad look for the couple, who happened to be middle-aged, affluent, Caucasian couple standing out with, basically an AR-15, couple of AR-15s, basically saying, get off my property and don't come here. And sure enough, they got charged for being on their own property with weapons they owned, telling people, I'm going to defend my property. And they got charged with that. So to any of you who ever think that achieving a level of success really, really absolutely protects you, and not when it gets political. And the reason is that politicians go with the whims of the people. It's very easy to become a scapegoat and to become on that victim side. So I mention that because it is worth thinking about making sure that you own some land, that you own a place that you're comfortable with, quality of life that has, maybe a ranch somewhere, maybe and maybe not every area of Montana is best because a lot of missile silos in Montana. But, maybe you don't want to be anywhere around those. But, the Chinese mapped them all with their balloon, it was that. I was going to say that, it's worth having that getaway place where you can be if things ever really get ugly, and be with your family and have your friends and have a quality of life. And, well water's awfully good, generators are awfully good, when you can have some wind and some solar and all that without going full bunker. Because quality of life is as important as surviving it.
Rob, we at best have 10 minutes. I have 7 questions we're not going to do justice to, but I'm still going to put pressure on you. Could we go round robin through these questions very quickly? We're not going to be able to get the context it deserves, but here we go. And some of them are hypersensitive. Do you personally believe in this upcoming election, perhaps on either, meaning U.S., United States, presidential, November of this year, no matter what might happen, do you somewhat question the results as it currently stands with voting machines and possibly rigging or manipulating the system?
Absolutely. And I give 1% to 2% tolerance for that across the microcosm on both sides at various towns in various states. I would say that there is always a 1% to 2% fudge factor in the total election outcomes. I've even seen some of it.
Do you have opinions on AI from the perspective of the advantage to the U.S. and possibly what adversaries, whether you define that as China, North Korea, Iran, and others, may have and maybe catch up that they're making?
Yeah. Okay. AI today is not really the AI we think it is. It's the ability to mimic things that a human might do and mimic, but it doesn't have the cognition that we think. A machine doesn't have context.
It doesn't have singularity, but one day it might.
It can have its programming that it is cognitive or that it is a singularity, but it doesn't. And so it's a series of rules. And it's sort of like going back to Archimedes, and you see the little puppets that he would build, the little mechanical men, and they would do all of these amazing things, which would astound us. But then we look at that today and we say, well, it's just a bunch of gears doing exactly what it is that they're programmed to do. That's all generative AI and large language models is doing today. But I will tell you, neural networks and knowledge graphs are going to change that, because now it's context. That's why we're in the knowledge graph business, because currently none of the AI out there is using knowledge graphs or neural networks for its own cognition. So we've been working in that area because that enables them to become self-aware. And so it's about context. So I think we are 10 years away from having a piece of software that actually has its own opinions on things. And that is when, not inference, opinions. And that's very different. So not pretending to have its opinions.
Okay. And going again, quick round robin. How far ahead of us are China and Russia on what could be deadly to us hypersonic nuclear missiles?
Well, I mean, hypersonic is hypersonic, and if you nuke them, if you use nukes or conventional or whatever you want to put on it, I think that the world is ahead of us on hypersonics. Yeah, period. And that's just a delivery mechanism for whatever it is you
Correct.
want
It's a delivery
to bring. But yeah, I to the best of my knowledge, yeah, the Russians and the Chinese are both ahead of us.
Should we be worried? And is their cyber capabilities great, more so, and the advancements of possibly nuclear with North Korea?
I think that, going back to Orwell, North Korea lives in a perpetual state of war because it must. It must in order to control its citizens, lest they look out and say, wow, everyone else has electricity and internet and Hyundai cars. So I don't worry one bit about North Korea, because North Korea must live under the threat of war. And if they actually had war, then it would just reveal the lie behind their narrative to their own people.
Should we have greater concerns about Pakistan, India-Pakistan relationships, and both? And I believe Pakistan also is a nuclear country.
Yeah, both are. And if you ever get a chance and you look up, what is his name, HQ Khan, you get into, it's not. I mean, the Pakistani government and the Indian government are going to do what they can do to preserve their borders, but there's a lot of Pakistani scientists and Indian scientists who are very smart in nukes that can export that technology to a non-nation state. And that's actually what keeps me awake at night. It's not what those nation states are going to do with nuclear technology, but it's what a well-funded organization could do that is not a nation state, or a nation state could do under the guise of a third party. So, a lot of smart scientists in those fields coming out of India and Pakistan. I think they're bored, and we run a risk that if we don't keep an eye on those folks, that they could be up to nefarious things.
The next question is worthy of 2 hours. We can only give it 1 minute. Your opinion about current status of quote unquote Russia in Ukraine. If you listen to the media, it's Ukraine is doing, with NATO's help, doing great. If you dig a little deeper, and we may disagree on this, I think Ukraine's in a lot of trouble.
I think they're both in a lot of trouble. I think that neither of them can quit. And I suspect they both wish they could. As a practical matter, there are Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine that were given as a part of Ukraine when the USSR dissolved, but they were Russian-speaking areas. Those people were always going to be on the precipice, because the Ukrainians don't exactly treat them particularly well, but they're not part of Russia. So, you look at those areas, Donbass and other regions, and you can go back to Abkhazia, Ossetia. You can go back to this whole thing over the last 15 years. There has been a Russian population within the official boundaries of Ukraine for years, and they don't get along well with the Ukrainians. Addressing that, it still needs to get done. So whether they become a part of Russia or whether they remain in Ukraine, most of it's a destroyed no man's land right now. So I would tell you that Ukraine, in my opinion, is not doing well because they're not moving forward, and the Russians are not doing well, and they are both terribly they're both terribly embroiled in a war that I think they both wish they could stop.
And perhaps two final quick questions. You actually hinted at it a little earlier. In the Red Sea, uh, drones being a threat to quote unquote Western and ships uh, are made for, at best, thousands of USD, yet we're needing to use multi-million dollar missiles. The math isn't making sense. How quick are we to develop effectively way more cost effective anti-drone technologies?
We're not. There's no money in it. Look, I mean, there's no money in it. There is money in building a $1 billion fighter jet. Nobody wants to build nobody wants to build an $8 million A-10. Nobody want the problem is we keep trying to out tech, and our ability to produce simple, deployable, non-high tech, high quantity systems. Well, the problem is there's no margin in that for a Raytheon, a Booz, all you name the company, Lockheed, GD. They're all great American companies, but they go where the dollars are. Dollars are in high tech, and right now I just don't see any. I don't see any efforts being funded appropriately to produce low tech, low cost solutions to these low tech, low cost threats.
Is the gigantic aircraft carriers that the US probably has, what, like 11 of them? They're monsters. They appear to be very formidable. They look, impressive. And I'm sure they're very deadly, powerful forces. But is it a little bit obsolete? Now, I thought that, but then I did have someone inform me it's not that they're all alone. They're surrounded by 5 far more nimble, smaller ships with more anti-drone technologies. So which side is right? Or are they both kind of right in their own way? It is antiquated, but it still is useful.
Yeah, well, the idea of taking an entire air base and being able to position it anywhere in the world still has utility. I think that it's not the aircraft carrier that has utility, it's the aircraft that have utility. And being able to base them on our terms, on our territory, because that aircraft carrier is a certain number of acres of sovereign U.S. territory. We don't ask for permission to launch out of there to go hit something like we have to do with Ali Al-Saleh or Al Assad or any of these other air bases we have in other countries. That's a piece of sovereign territory. So they have value. And by the way, the entourage for an aircraft carrier, if you really look carefully, because some of those ships seem really small compared to the carrier, there might be 30 ships with that carrier.
Yeah.
Of various sizes.
Probably subs.
Yeah,
so
I think we still have to do it.
Effectively, it's not just out there as an island by itself.
No, it's not. It is an entire apparatus to protect itself, fuel itself, feed itself, and its might is the aircraft, but also the ability to launch rounds from the destroyers and cruisers and missiles and all of that. Is it expensive? Yes, it is. Is it essential? Yes, it is, at least for the next 40 years. Beyond 40 years, I would say space-based weapons just completely make it obsolete.
US, China, Russia, who's most advanced, do you think, in that or will be?
Well, the US is the only one of the three that has an uniformed alumni who is seasoned at war. We're it. You go look at our military today. You know, there is a percentage of people who've been at war on and off for years. They kind of get it. The Russians, the people who are seasoned at war, high victim, but the Chinese are completely untested. So even regardless of what the technology and the quantity of their equipment is, the people have never been to war. So they don't even know what that's like. And they can't look to their senior leader in the military and ask them. And the Russians have just really just lost a lot of people. So, they've been fighting with conscripts now for, 18 months, almost 2 years. So, yeah, I would say we are still more advanced with more ability to use it. I think that that's in decline. I think that our maintenance of our equipment is going to be our undoing. We're not maintaining our equipment, and our readiness is getting less and less and less and less. And yeah, that's a problem.
It sounds like a very good assessment. As we wrap up and people would like to be more familiar, and we didn't really get into enough, your incredible success as an entrepreneur and what you're doing with your company. I believe it's pronounced Equitas Corporation. And I know you have to run soon, but in your final 2 minutes, tell us a little bit about your company. And for those that would like to learn more or interact in any way, whether it's social media, whether it's a book you did, whether it's your company, if possible, how can they learn more about you, Rob, and reach out?
Yeah. Okay. So Equitas in a nutshell, when I left active duty, I wanted to go back to, being married, raising a family, and living in the commercial world. And I was asked to do some consulting, to set up a consulting business. And one of the questions we were given is, SOCOM spends $7 billion a year on, and they have all of these systems that don't talk to each other. What's the strategy to get past the fact that, and that could be the same in any Fortune 500 company, you have all these different systems that don't talk to each other. And my answer was, we need to create a dynamic data abstraction layer, which is a geek word of saying a language that data can talk to data regardless of the system and without interfering with the systems. And in order to do that, you had to create and invent a series of technologies. It's like going to the moon. If you want to get to the moon, you've got to invent and create technologies that did not exist. So we had to create our own graph technologies, our own neural network technologies, our own natural language processing, our own all the math and algorithms and linguistics and the way the systems work, including video and satellite imagery and LiDAR. And we had to develop all of the ways for that data as it is to come in to a single context. Now, we're not an AI. It's Equitas.ai, but we're not really an AI company in that we don't mimic human behavior. What we do is we help software that mimics human behavior to actually have real meaningful data and context in order to tie its solution so that it's not just saying things that sound real, it's actually giving you good data. And that's where we fit into the industry. So we're a niche, we're a back-end installation in other people's networks and softwares. And it's big dollar software. I'm not going to kid you. There's nothing you can buy at Equitas for, $100K. So they're multi-million-dollar investments by companies. But if you owned an insurance company and you needed to know all that you know from all of your systems and be able to ask a single question out of everything, we're it. I mean, that's what we do, is we have a system that reads and knowledge graphs all of the factlets and creates a single context that now you can build your tools on top of. So, we're even, we're doing, auto racing. Our system is actually fusing all these sensors in race cars, and we're doing some energy systems for hospitals where they have all these generators and they all need to talk to each other in a single language so that the system can make the best decision. But we're also doing intelligence and a lot of intelligence systems for military. So it was nice to be able to retire so I can focus exclusively on this and get out of the reserves. So, but yeah, this is what we do. It's a lot of fun, and we're in Florida, which is a great place to be. And what do they call it? The free state of Florida.
Indeed. And by the way, the company is spelled EQUITUS Corporation. Rob is a great guy. Again, very appreciative of his service. Retired Brigadier General Robert Guidry. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I know you're going to have to run. I'll do about a 90-second close, but I don't want to hold you up. You can feel free to exit if you'd like. It was great to be introduced to you by our mutual friend, Lisa Miriam. I appreciate your time when we caught up a week ago, and definitely for your time sharing to my audience today. I look forward to learning more about your company and having you back in the future. There's never a shortage of issues going on around the world, geopolitically, military, that would love to get your opinion. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Angelo. It was a pleasure to be here.
And everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. Again, some of you know me for many a decade, the founder at Family Office Association. I had my exit from that about a year ago, took a little time off to travel, but I just love what I do in the single family office community so much. A couple of months was enough of me being around the home and traveling a little bit of the world. I learned so much from so many amazing people. So Family Office TV, which I launched in the summer, is a labor of love. I like to interview, I'm just naturally curious, with incredible people like today's guest, Rob. I would do it if it was just private, but I'm happy to share it. And my guests that come on that are open to sharing with many of you as well. My private network at SFO Continuity gets some level of more exclusive opportunity and interviews, some level of live access to also interact with the guests, and more of a level of connectivity with them. There's many, many other benefits that they get as well, but that would be core to it. And again, my Family Office Masterclass, including some of the topics we spoke about today with a lot of my military, geopolitical, and other thinkers, is a very, very important aspect to it. Sovereign risk and disaster preparedness. There are lots that could go wrong. And today we had to quickly rush through the final 4 or 5 questions that each of them we could have dove into deeply. We didn't even really have enough time to do a deeper dive into the war and challenges in the Middle East. So these are topics that, again, if you look at the research that a lot of the big banks and organizations are doing as to the #1 concern of the super rich and family offices heading into 2024, it was geopolitics, geopolitics, and geopolitics. These are very important as it pertains to family continuity, as it pertains to investing, as it pertains to really effectively everything. Remember the interviews that I've done with generational families of Europe hundreds of years ago, families active in politics, in military, and in clergy. And now the dynamics have changed. Politics will probably always be something families of wealth would want to be active in and very important. But now it's different subjects and topics to effectively impact the minds of the masses, if you want to call it that. We do live in interesting times, in some ways exciting and thrilling, in some ways gravely challenging. I'm here to be a resource. Feel free to look into what I do, angelorobles.com. For now, I keep it under one umbrella, kind of covers it all. I look forward to you reaching out and learning more and perhaps joining and being a part of who we are. Thank you so much. Again, at angelorobles.com. Everyone have a great day. Thank you for your time.